Hero Time, Chapter 12, Moving Forward. Verdona didn't head straight for the rust bucket, though. Instead, she headed to Jen. The girl was on her feet in milliseconds, spinning the dial on the Omnitrix as the intruder alarm blared and Verdona frowned. No need to get uptight, kiddo, it's just Grandma. Verdona snapped her fingers and the alarm shut off. Jen blinked tired eyes at her. Grandma, what are you doing here? I thought you were only interested in Gwen. It was true, Gwen was the more interesting of the two, Verdona could admit that, but there was hurt in her granddaughter's eyes. She frowned. You haven't been sleeping, have you? Jen didn't have to answer that, her aura did the talking for her. Confusion, guilt, anger, hurt, exhaustion, it all pulsed along the team's energy field so brightly it was a wonder she managed to keep it all off her face. Verdona would guess she'd had practice. She frowned and stepped forward before Jen could answer her question. She laid a finger to her granddaughter's forehead and it glowed pink. Jen collapsed into her grandmother's arms. She was sound asleep. Verdona held out a hand and Jen floated off the ground, snoring softly. She snapped the fingers of her free hand and they vanished from the flummer base, reappearing in Jen's room. Verdona laid her granddaughter down on her bed and waved a hand at her. In a flash of pink, she was in a pair of very comfortable-looking pajamas, and her clothes from that day were clean and folded on the desk. The blanket on Jen's unmade bed floated over the teen, and Verdona smiled. The door creaked open, and a familiar gasp met Verdona's ears. Mom? The question was incredulous and rather loud. Verdona held up a hand to her mouth, shushing her son. Carl, you'll wake your daughter. Carl blinked as he stepped into the room and smiled slightly at his daughter asleep in her bed. Everything okay, honey? Sandra called through the door. She peeked around the door and her eyes went wide. Verdona! Verdona sighed and snapped her fingers, teleporting the three of them out of Jen's room so the poor girl could get some undisturbed sleep. Stars knew she needed it. Soon they all had tea. No cookies, though. Apparently Jen had eaten the last of the ones they had in the house. Verdona toyed with the petal of a sunflower from a bouquet that sat in a vase on the kitchen table. What are you doing here? Carl's question was more confused than harsh. It had been a long time since they had seen each other, after all. I came here to reminisce about Max. Carl frowned. Did something happen to Dad? Verdona let out an unnecessary breath. He's gone missing, dear. Though it's an occupational hazard for a plumber. Carl frowned. Thought you didn't know about that. Verdona laughed. Your brother said the same thing, but no, I always knew. She picked up one of the flowers and tilted her head at it. She wasn't really listening to the conversation she was having. Instead, she was feeling out the residue of the different mana signature on the flowers. A semi-energy being. An Apollinite, if she wasn't very much mistaken. She smiled. So Jen had inherited Max's good taste. I decided that I would check in on everyone while I was here. Carl frowned into his cup. I appreciate that, Mom, but Jen doesn't know about any of it. She has no idea you're an alien, unless you told her. Carl's hands tightened on his mug. Verdona could see it in his face that he truly believed his daughter, who wielded one of the universe's most powerful weapons on her wrist, had no idea that aliens were real. Well, she could play along. Of course not, dear. She laughed as though the idea of her revealing her true nature to her granddaughter were what was funny, not the fact that Jen's father was so clueless about his daughter's life. She'd fallen asleep at the library. I couldn't just leave my granddaughter there, now could I? Carl and Sandra breathed out in relief. Verdona had to hold back her laughter, but she managed it. So who's the boy who gave her these? Carl frowned. It was some new boy at her school, Al. Verdona smiled. She was familiar with the Apollonites and the delicate situation the planet sat in at the moment. The youngest son of the ruling family, along with three of his brothers, had been sent off-world to keep them safe from the incursions. Apparently, one of them, Albrassic said aghast, had found something on this backwater world that she herself had found years ago, an appreciation for a Tennyson. Cute. Verdona set the flower back into the vase. I'll be on planet for a few days, but I'm staying at the rest bucket for old time's sake. Carl nodded and opened his arms. Verdona hugged her son, feeling the human life under his skin. It was so fragile it almost made her sad how easy it would be for her human children to be destroyed. But Max had once told her that life was precious because it ends. She smiled at her son and ruffled his hair. Chapter 13. Confronting the Maker. True to her word, Verdona stuck around for a few days on Earth. Gwen was much more skilled and controlled than Sunny. She also got to witness something of a confrontation between Frank and Jen, who decided to hang around the house to get to know Grandma too. Verdona knew that Jen was worried about leaving her alone with Gwen, even though her cousin could handle herself. Frank had approached Jen with a serious look on his face one afternoon as Jen watched TV in the living room, keeping one eye on the window to the backyard where Verdona and Gwen were training. So your grandma didn't say anything about you having powers? Jen shook her head. I don't. She said it around a mouthful of chili fries, and Frank frowned at her. Except you do. You turned into an alien I've never seen before the other night to help Gwen. It was appreciated, but how did you do that? Verdona's focus shifted. She wanted to know the story behind the Omnitrix, too. As an energy being, splitting her focus was easy. Jen swallowed her mouthful of chili fries and looked down at her shoes. That's not powers. Not like Gwen's, I mean. She does what she can do naturally. I can't do it without this. She held up her arm, the Omnitrix flashing under the lights. What is that? It's called the Omnitrix. I found it when I was 10. Verdona's eyes narrowed. 10 years old was far too young for one small human to have the responsibility of worlds heaped upon her. Even she knew that. It lets me turn into different aliens. I used to be able to turn into one set of 10, but then I took it off for 5 years, and when I put it back on, it changed. Now I've got a new set. It's pretty cool, really. She shoved some more chili fries in her mouth. Frank frowned. Do your parents know? Jen shook her head vigorously, swallowing her food so fast she almost choked. No, and you can't tell them. Please, Uncle Frank, it'll just make them worry, and you know how Dad gets when he's worried. Frank looked her over for a moment, then nodded. All right. At least you're not doing anything dangerous. Jen's smile became forced as she hugged her uncle. Thanks, Uncle Frank. Frank missed her guilty shift in expression and simply hugged her back. That night, Verdona decided she would take her leave. She did something she normally didn't do, and informed someone about it, though, and Frank, Jen, Gwen, and Kevin were there to see her off. She decided she'd let Carl keep his fantasy of a normal family for a little while longer. They all met up at Max's secret fishing rock, and Verdona laid a hand on the tree where Max had once carved their names. It was good to come back. She grinned and pulled Gwen into a hug. I'll be back from time to time to check up on you and see how you're doing. Gwen grinned. Verdona turned to Jen. You did well sticking up for your cousin like that. And you got my sense of humor and Max's good taste. You'll be amazing. For a human, anyway. Jen rolled her eyes as Verdona pulled her into a hug and ruffled her hair. Then the Anodite turned to Kevin, the Osmosian, twitched. You remind me of Max when he was younger. Wild and fun. You'll need that to keep up with my granddaughters. Kevin blinked and nodded, his eyes flicking to Gwen. He went slightly pink and stared at his shoes. Aw, he's shy. Keep hold of this one, Gwen. I like him. Jen snorted. Verdona fixed wide eyes on the brunette. I like your boy, too. You got Max's excellent taste. Jen went bright red and tried to hide her head in her hands as Frank shot a look at his niece. Verdona grinned. Jen managed to suppress her blush. No one can know he's here, Grandma. Verdona nodded. Of course not, darling. I don't meddle in the affairs of physical beings, unless their name is Tennyson. She grinned and flew off into space, leaving behind a yellow and pink blossom. She had a scientist to visit. Her reception on Galvin Prime wasn't the friendliest of things, but she made it to Azimuth's lab with ease. She smiled at him as the Galvin stared at her, completely unperturbed. You must be Azimuth. Lovely to meet you. My name is Verdona Tennyson. That got a reaction, though she didn't usually introduce herself with Max's last name, as that was more of an Earth tradition. Azimuth raised what passed for eyebrows in his species. Tennyson. He shook his head. It would be. So I assume you're here about Jennifer? Verdona smiled. The thinker lives up to his reputation. Are you aware she's put your Omnitrix back on? Azimuth nodded. I was aware the moment she placed it back on her wrist. If you're asking me to remove it, she can make that choice herself. She put it on, she can come ask to get it off. Verdona waved her hand dismissively. She can take care of that herself. I came to find out if you know just what that device of yours has done to her. Azimuth raised an eyebrow. Enlighten me. His tone told Verdona he was humoring her, but she didn't mind. He knew the kind of danger he was in. Apollonites were Anodites were fiercely protective of what was theirs. It was something Verdona had been forced to unlearn a bit with Max, but her grandchild was just that, a child. nearing adulthood, but not there yet. The Omnitrix has fused with her on a level far beyond the physical. She's got the aura of a galvanic mechamorph, a techno-organic being. Asmus blinked, but looked unsurprised. It was bound to happen eventually. He turned back to his current project, but kept speaking so Verdona knew she wasn't being ignored. The Omnitrix has always been a piece of technology that even I never fully understood. It evolves. When Jennifer put it back on, it sensed that time had passed, and its user had aged. It allowed her access to a set of aliens previously thought too advanced for her. Verdona tilted her head as Asmus continued. You're likely not wrong that she has fused with the Omnitrix to the point where she can be classified as a techno-organic human. Asmus turned back to Verdona. Did you tell her? She has other things to worry about. Asmus nodded at the energy being. Verdona frowned. If something were to happen to your Omnitrix, what would happen to my granddaughter? Asmus frowned. That even I don't know. It was never planned to go to her. That was something even I didn't plan for. Verdona nodded. There is only one constant you can be sure of with any Tennyson. And what, pray tell, is that? They always surprise you. Asmus nodded as Verdona smiled. Chapter 14, Growing Up. Gwen didn't like goop. Most of the time, watching Jen change into aliens was fine. Ghost Freak had been scary towards the end when it had changed. Watching Jen's head rotate until her whole face was upside down had been a bit traumatizing. Though, thankfully, that wasn't a problem anymore, but seeing her cousin melt into a puddle of green goo controlled by a tiny floating metal disc, well, Gwen just hoped Jen didn't use goop too often. After Jen transformed, the fight was mercifully brief, though ending up covered in the sentient goo that her cousin was made of at the moment had been beyond nasty. Jen, get off of us! Kevin was coated in the goo from the Technodon's explosion too. Sorry! This transformation made her voice nasally and a bit metallic, as it appeared to be coming from the metal disc that swooped over them, collecting the goop back into a humanoid shape before the green light flashed, and her cousin stood before them once more. She grinned. Just like old times, huh? Gwen rolled her eyes. At least I'm not cleaning stink fly gunk out of my hair, Kevin laughed. Yeah, I remember that being pretty hard. Jen laughed, and Kevin tossed the gauntlet into the trunk of his car. He picked his way into the rubble of the robot and scooped up a small black box. Jen frowned as if she was going to say something, but her phone interrupted her. She glanced down and frowned. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. Hello? Hello, Jen. Julie gave me your number. I hope that is all right. Jen grinned. That's fine, Al. I was actually wondering if you had a phone. I do indeed. Magister Labrid insisted that both Varaxi and I have Earth methods of communication. I was wondering if you would like to accompany me out today. Perhaps you could introduce me to some Earth culture. I will admit I know little about this world. Jen grinned. I'd love to. Meet me at Mr. Smoothie's in like 10 minutes? Very well. I have one question. What is a smoothie? Jen laughed. I think you'll like it. Very well. I shall trust your judgment. Jen could hear Al smiling. I'll see you there. I will arrive punctually. I look forward to your company. Me too. She hung up and spotted Kevin grinning at her as she slipped into the back seat. Jen's got a boyfriend. His voice was sing-song, and Jen flipped him off but couldn't help the grin on her face as they drove down the streets of Bellwood. Taking Al to Mr. Smoothie was probably the best idea Jen had ever had. The Apollinite had never had a smoothie before, and it was about time that she introduced him to Gwen and Kevin. Gwen was moderating between Kevin and Al, who didn't seem to be getting along all that well, while Jen went to get the next round of smoothies. Nectarine smoothies for everybody. She grinned and turned only for her tray to be flipped onto her front. She sighed as the cold flush soaked her shirt. Guess I should have said on, everybody. She muttered under her breath. Cash and JT laughed at her. Seriously? Yeah, what are you gonna do about it, Tennyson? Cash shoved her and came away with his hands sticky and covered in smoothie. He made a disgusted noise in the back of his throat and wiped the smoothie on his shirt. The gathered crowd of their classmates laughed, and Jen spotted Kevin walking up behind Cash, cracking his knuckles. Jen shook her head at him and he stopped. Not even worth it, Cash. The bully froze. Seriously? Spilling my drink? What are you, 5? Look around, Cash. We all grew up. Maybe it's time you did too. Jen turned back to the window as her classmates applauded. She had just intended to grab a handful of napkins to clean herself up with, but she found herself face to face with one of her classmates, Sydney. The other girl held out a stack of napkins with one hand, and with her other snapped the lid on the last of a set of a new tray full of smoothies. Thanks for that. It's about time somebody stood up to Cash. Jen grinned and reached for her wallet to pay for the new smoothies, but Sydney shook her head. I'm the house, since yours got filled. Jen grinned and thanked the other girl. She took the fresh smoothies and handed them to Kevin. Taking half the napkins, she began to clean up the mess Cash and JT had left behind. Both boys had left. In a moment, though, someone joined her. She smiled at Al as he picked up the fallen tray. Gwen nodded in approval. I like him. Al smiled as Jen began to dab smoothie off her shirt and jacket. I am glad I have gained your approval. Jen has spoken very highly of you, Gwen. It is lovely to meet you. Gwen grinned at Jen, who was pointedly not looking at any of her friends. Al turned to Kevin. I am also glad to meet you. I must apologize for making a hasty judgment about you when I first saw you. I assumed you were a troublemaker. Kevin laughed. Oh, make no mistake. I am a troublemaker. I'm just on the right side now. Jen and Gwen laughed as Kevin shook Al's hand.